And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Michael Byers, author of Intent for a Nation. And here in studio, John Duffy, principal at Strategy Corp. Mel Watkins, professor emeritus of political science and economics at the University of Toronto. David Warren, columnist at the Ottawa Citizen. And Andrew Potter, columnist at Maclean's. And it's good to have Michael, you on the line all the way from BC, and great to have you guys here in the studio for a discussion about a guy I want to start by saying that, you know, we who have lived in this country for a while know, but we have a lot of new Canadians on this program for whom the name George Grant doesn't mean anything. So we want to talk to them tonight as well. And to that end, we've got a great archive in the basement of this place. So let's start with this clip, shall we, Michael Smith? Here's Bob Fulford on the TVO program Realities in 1983, interviewing George Grant. Roll tape.
You know, I don't think rage is a good motive for writing. You know, as a Platonist, I just don't think rage is ever a good motive for anything. And that book was written in anger from my love for old Diefenbaker. And that one should have been summoned to write a book that had influence over other people's minds by a bad motive is particularly ironic to me. It is extremely difficult to live without finite hopes in the world. I mean, hope is, to me as a Christian, a virtue, but it's a virtue about the eternal order, you know, that one must, hope is a great, great virtue. But people take hope as very immediate thing, and people want hope. People took the more hopeful sides of Lament for a Nation seriously and didn't take the more philosophic sides very seriously.
5 years ago, they brought it out again, and you, Andrew, did one of the forwards for the book, so I want to start with you. Most of us, I think, when we think of the 60s, thought Canada was a pretty cool place. We had a new flag, we had a pretty cool new prime minister, we had Expo 67, a 100th birthday celebration, and yet here's George Grant lamenting for a nation that he sees about to go kaput.
Right.
How come?
Well, I think, like you said in the clip we just saw, we need to take George Grant seriously. You need to take the other side of his argument seriously, which is a side that looks at the technology, the growth of liberalism and technology, capitalism, and sees a very pessimistic take on that, and not only just pessimistic but almost deterministic. Grant really saw at the level of political theory, not political practice, but political theory, the idea that North America was the vanguard of what he called the universal homogenous state, a liberal technocratic order in which all particularity, all difference would inevitably disappear. And that's something that a lot of people didn't take seriously, to the great advantage of Canadian nationalists who sort of built a nationalism out of his critique, failing to sort of grasp, I think, completely just how pessimistic the theory side of his critique was.
Mel, I want to take you back to the 60s, which was a big time in your political life. You were part of a movement that was an offshoot of the New Democratic Party called the Waffle Movement. And you obviously did not think Canada as a nation was finished, but your nationalism, I'm guessing, was different from his nationalism. How so?
Well, I was greatly influenced by George Grant. Grant was a marvelous man who was very open to talking to everyone. He was a powerful speaker. He was a spellbinder when he wanted to be as an orator. The first time I read Lament for a Nation, I had a lot of problems with it. I was in a transition myself. This is the 60s. It's an unusual time. And Grant became this incredible person who spoke to those young people who were part of the New Left. He was one of the very first people to oppose the war in Vietnam on the Canadian side. He was, those of us who were younger people and were opposed to that war, Grant was like a saint to us. I think now, looking back on it, it's a long time ago, 45 years is quite a long time. I would just pick up on something that Andrew said about the universal homogeneous state, which is the deeper analysis. I sometimes think that George was very prescient, because that sounds to me a lot like globalization.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's what George was talking about. I think he may have overestimated the ability of the likelihood that cultures would disappear. I think the Canadian culture was stronger, although George helped make it stronger.
John, I want to go to you because you were Were you born in the 60s yet? You're a little kid anyway. You were
kid.
You're a tiny little kid in the 60s, so you obviously didn't know him. But as you read what he wrote then, I mean, clearly you wouldn't have shared that kind of pessimism about the future of Canada. Where's that coming from?
I had a funny encounter with George Grant, the man and the work. My father is a professor, and I'm sure he's watching, and he knew George Grant, and he introduced me to George Grant. George Grant came over for dinner, and I was allowed to sit at the table with the great man, provided I kept my little mouth shut.
How old would you have been at the time?
I don't know, about 12 or 13 or 14 or 15, something like that. So I kept my mouth shut, and I listened to this incredible guy, and it was fantastic. I'd heard about this book, and I instinctively agreed with it because I was a little left-wing New Democrat teenager, anti-American, don't like Nixon, don't like the Republicans, terrified of Reagan, all this stuff. So I just knew that this was my guy because he didn't like America. Then I read the book, and it was not at all what I thought it would be. It was this conservative, blue-colored, English, Jesus,
Diefenbaker-loving,
profoundly Christian, deeply moral, Diefenbaker-esque thing. It just struck me as totally reactionary. And I think a lot of people, there's a lot to be said for the idea of what Mel is talking about it being a manifesto for a generation. The cover and the title. The stuff in between, I think most people went right past it and just stuck with the cover and interpreted what Grant was saying as being in support of a Canadian nationalism that really had nothing to do with where Grant was really coming from, which was this deep and profoundly conservative view of the country.
Speaking of deep and profoundly conservative, David Warren is here tonight. You knew him, right? He was very influential in your life.
I didn't know him in the 60s. I was also very young at the time. I got to know him in the early 80s, in the years immediately before the Idler got kickstarted. And alas, he died. He was one of our regular correspondents in the Idler for its first few years.
Idler was, you should say 20 seconds about what that was for people who don't know.
An attempt to produce a magazine of elevated general interest, literary, certainly conservative, but we would have had to spend most of our time explaining what we meant by the word.
Has anything changed in the country to where we are today that would have made George Grant, given how you knew him, less pessimistic about where we are?
No, I think he would be more pessimistic today than before, but at the same time, he had already recovered from the early 80s from just what he was describing to Bob Fulford on that television clip, which was the rage behind it. He was exactly describing, I think, what the motivation of that book was. What strikes me as I was just rereading it only this morning and looking into it for the first time in a long time was what an astute analysis he was giving of the actual politics of the 1960 to 1965 period as I understand it today. Through the fog of memory, I had thought of him as being effete, as being at best professorial and perhaps a little visionary about things. But actually, he has named all the names in the right order. He is describing the deceits in Canadian politics with great precision. And the book is not nearly as naive as I remember it being. And yet, he means what he says. It is a lament. It is a backward-looking book, purposely. His anti-Americanism goes back to 1776, and it's a deeply felt anti-Americanism from that age. Talking to him about somebody like Thomas Jefferson would be great fun, because that would bring out his full anti-Americanism. Whereas on the other hand, if I said to him, name a politician today, this is in the mid-80s, whom you admire in the United States, without the slightest hesitation, he said, Jesse Helms.
Jesse Helms?
You bet.
And not Thomas Jefferson.
Because Jesse Helms had recently said, I'm willing to lose my seat in Congress rather than change my views on abortion. That's what appealed to
Jesse Helms,
to
the
Grant.
Incredibly racist Southern, not particularly, anyway, on we go. Okay, Michael Byers, your turn.
He was, of course, still trying to be provocative after all of that time.
Well, that worked. Michael Byers, love the title of your book, Intent for a Nation. Obviously, we know what you're playing off of there. But how different is the nation that you talk about in your book from the one lamented by George Grant in his?
Well, it's a much older country. It's been 46 years since Lament for a Nation was published. And it's easy to criticize Grant for not foreseeing some of the major developments of the last 46 years. But he did actually make a very important statement about the rise of continentalism, the almost centrifugal force of U.S. hegemony, both military, economic, and especially cultural. He did foresee that globalization would change the way we think and change the way that we behave vis-a-vis others. And you know, the country has changed. What I don't think he anticipated was that the country would actually remain relatively independent from the United States, because as we become more American, the Americans move on. They evolve in ways and become different from what we might be changing towards. And so I think he would you know, look with great interest at the rise of sort of Reagan republicanism. George W. Bush, I think, would have angered him quite a bit. A conservative who would have angered Grant. I don't know what he would make of Barack Obama. I think he would certainly be very interested in the internet and the effects of technology, which was something he wrote about back in the 1960s. But the thing I think that would probably surprise him most and probably please him is that Canada has retained some foreign policy independence vis-a-vis the United States. We stayed out of the Iraq War in 2003. We stayed out of missile defense in 2005. And a conservative Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, has used the Canadian Investment Act on 2 occasions to block foreign takeovers of Canadian companies, McDonald Detweiler and Saskatchewan Potash. Canada's still independent. I think Grant would be happy about that. I think he'd be happy that he was, to a significant extent, wrong.
Mel, let me follow up with you on that, because that's a fair point. That for a guy who thought that the country, well, he's absolutely excoriating of Lester Pearson in this book about how Pearson's just going along with what all the Americans want to do on foreign policy. And Michael just gave a pretty good checklist of some things where Canada has shown considerable backbone against what the Americans wanted.
Well, but he's right, but there's another side to that list too. There's something called the Free Trade Agreement, which was coming in just as George was dying, and he was certainly opposed to that. You know, George is, look at our environmental policy today. Mr. Harper just tries to keep up with Obama, but Obama's not doing anything. There's nothing to keep up with. It's harder. That's maybe the major issue that the world faces today, and we have no independence there. We choose to be dependent, and George always understood that. There was this kind of comprador role. George came from the elites himself, but he did not like the elites, and that was why he was so attractive to the left and the New Left in the 1960s.
John, your party chose to be independent on the issue of the Iraq War. George Grant presumably would have been happy that Canada decided to stay out of that one.
Yeah, he would have. And I think he would have also been a little bit bewildered, though, because George Grant's world, this is one of the things that makes it a little difficult to find your way through the book as you try to read it, if you're new to it, it's an inverted world where actually the pro-Americans are the liberals and the anti-Americans are the conservatives. Canadian politics does this every sort of 50 or 60 years. It flips over. You go back for the longest amount of time, up until Grant's era, the Liberals were in fact the pro-American party, going back to the era of Laurier in the 1891 election. They were the free trade pro-American party, and the British, pro-British, anti-free trade party was the Conservative Party. Then, right around when Grant's writing, right around this 1963 election, right around the Pierce administration, and the rise of the NDP, or the changing of the CCF into the NDP, it all flips over. And all of a sudden, the people who've got big problems with America are concentrated on the left, in first the NDP and then the Liberal Party. And over a brief period of time, largely under Mulroney, the Conservatives, who'd been the anti-American party, become the pro-American party. A lot of what's happened, if you step back and look at that little chessboard, is really, and this would make Grant very upset, is that our politics has come to resemble that of the United States, where the pro-free market party and the party for a muscular, realistic foreign policy is the pro-American party. Looks kind of Republican. And the international nationalist, multilateralist, interventionist, more welfare state-oriented party has lined up and become the party of the left, much like the Democratic Party. So in a lot of ways, even though the characters have changed, what it really looks like if you step back and squint is that our politics has started to look like American politics. That would be something that would make Dr. Grant Lament, with a whole new chapter and a whole new brilliant intervention, much better than I can encapsulate it.
Speaking of it, we really should read an excerpt before we go any further here, just so people who haven't read it can hear a little bit about what we've got to say, and then let's chat about this. Michael, this graphic, if we can. Canada, he wrote, has ceased to be a nation, but its former political existence will not end quickly. Our social and economic blending into the empire will continue apace, but political union will probably be delayed. Some international catastrophe or great shift of power might speed up the process. Its slowness does not depend only on the fact that large numbers of Canadians do not want it, but also on sheer lethargy. Andrew, how much has lethargy saved our bacon at the end of the day?
I don't think too much. I've always loved that passage, and I loved it a lot when I was younger, when I was much more in favor of the argument of the book. And because I remember when 9/11 happened, I thought, that's the international catastrophe that he's talking about, right? And you can remember after that happened, everyone kind of instinctively a lot of pundits started sort of repeating Grant's argument. Richard Gwynne, Jeffrey Simpson, a whole bunch of others, Michael Bliss, all started writing these, this is the end of Canada. I think Richard Gwynne said, we have achieved the virtual sovereignty.
Virtual sovereignty
was his term. People, in fact, there was even a book, right, I think, Politics Without Walls, I think, wasn't that?
Nationalism Without Walls.
Right. Anyway, so you had this idea that this was the big event that was going to kill Canada once and for all, and it didn't happen. And a few years later, John Ralston Saul wrote The Return of the Nation, right, a book all about the return of the nation state. And I think lethargy does not explain it. There's something else going on that makes Canada a robust nation against globalization, against America, against the continent. And what that is something far more subtle than this idea of shared values, shared conservative values that Grant was on about. And I think a full understanding of what nationalism is in the globalized era needs to take that into consideration.
David, lethargy, has that played a role in any of this?
I think lethargy has always played a role in this sort of thing. There's no particular reason to change something, nothing changes. And one of the points that Grant would have made was that he wasn't predicting the demise of Canada as an administrative unit. It could function much more efficiently as a separate administrative unit, and if so, it would be allowed to continue in those terms. It was only if something got in the way of the machinery that it would be changed. I think what we're missing here, again, is the brilliant backward-looking nature of Grant's vision. One of the ironies that came up when I was speaking to him in the 1980s was that the Canada he was referring to was no longer conscious of itself. History was no longer being taught in our schools. The sense that we also have an account of 1776, that we also have an account of developments through the 19th century, has been lost through the school system. Paradoxically, the Americans, a form of American exceptionalism had emerged. The Americans were now the only people in the Western world with a consciousness of their own constitutional history, who were still having it taught to themselves in the schools. Whereas Canada, like Sweden, like France, like any other of the nanny states in Europe, had no history anymore. The United States was the only country with age and dignity. Much as he despised it, we had just become more vacuous than that.
Michael, pick up on this if you would. George Grant was a Red Tory. You say you're a Red Tory, but you ran when you ran for public office for the New Democrats. So his brand of Red Toryism, where is it today in Canada?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because I was thinking back to my grandparents who lived on a farm in southern Saskatchewan in the 1960s and who voted for Diefenbaker federally and for Tommy Douglas provincially and saw no contradiction between that. I mean, Grant's conservatism was an old-fashioned, organic British conservatism that valued the community, that believed in government, that had an idea of a country that was somewhat inward-looking and looked after its fellow citizens rather than looking simply at individualism and liberty as the absolute ideal. I think that Grant would be surprised today by the fact that the Red Tories have nowhere to go in Canada's political landscape. Stephen Harper's Conservative Party dropped the Progressive, which was a very important signal of what Diefenbaker, Grant, Joe Clark, and others were all about, and became more Republican. The NDP is obviously different, but it shares some of the values of that old Toryism. And of course, there are liberals who shared part of that too. Pierre Trudeau was, to some degree, a social democrat rather than just a liberal, and we saw that with some of his policies during his time as Prime Minister. It is complex, and today, what would George Grant be? I don't think he would be a big supporter of Stephen Harper. He might support Elizabeth May, who in some respects is a bit of an old-fashioned Red Tory. He might support Jack Layton, whose father was a cabinet minister in Brian Mulroney's cabinet, a Red Tory cabinet minister. Would he support his nephew, Michael Ignatieff? That's a question for the rest of the panel. I'm a little bit skeptical that he would.
John?
Well, I think he would. First of all, because Michael Ignatieff is an estimable and excellent person, and secondly, because George Grant loved family, and he loved his sister, and his sister loved her son, so there you go. But I think we've talked a little bit about whether this thread of the Canadian nationalist tradition is still really with us, and I think it's really frayed, diminished, become somewhat bare. Ignatieff, since re-arrival in Canada, has really made a very explicit and conscious effort to try to revive this kind of discussion about Canadian identity and nationhood. He talked frequently about the spine of citizenship. What does it mean? He involved a lot of people who come out of the places where these things are still discussed.
He says his uncle was wrong.
He
rejects his uncle.
He disagrees with his uncle on a number of fundamental points, but the idea of talking about Canadian nationhood as a politics is something that Michael's really tried to do. It hasn't gone over. And in fact, a lot of what happened, if it just finished, a demonstrator of how things have really changed in this country, a lot of what's happened in the past year or so since he's gotten on the buses and started talking to the folks that are really what the election's about, is he's really dropped that rhetoric. And I don't think he's lost the intellectual conviction. I think he's just found that this debate no longer has the currency in this country than it did when young people like the then very youthful Mel Watkins, who is still somewhat youthful, were picking up their copies of George Grant and really reading them carefully. That thread in our politics is really diminished enormously.
Michael Byers, you want to come back at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's significant, although Stephen Harper is no George Grant Tory, that he too has sought to identify with Canadian nationalism, whether it's his Arctic sovereignty policy, use it or lose it, whether it's wrapping the Afghanistan mission very much in the Canadian flag and promoting the sense that these soldiers are quintessentially Canadian in this struggle, or whether it's celebrating the euphoria that we saw on the streets of Vancouver during the Winter Olympics last year. I mean, anyone who doubted that Canadian nationalism was alive and well only had to be here, where I'm sitting, to realize that, yes, Canadians love this country. We love celebrating our accomplishments. We haven't had this beaten out of us by 46 years of continental economics. If George Grant was wrong on one thing, he was wrong about nationalism being connected primarily to economics. Nationalism is not just about GDP. Nationalism is about a very deep love of country.
Okay, and, Andrew Potter wants to follow up here, Michael.
I saw this in Vancouver.
Andrew, right. And then, sorry.
Yeah, I would just say it's worth emphasizing that for Grant, though, Canada wasn't valuable for its own sake. It wasn't worth just simply having a nation of one type or another. There were specific values associated with the kind of Canada he wanted, as John pointed out at the very beginning. And the values that have sort of become emblematic of Canada in the last decade, 15 years, are certainly not values that George Grant would have liked. When Michael Ignatieff talks about the spine of citizenship, he connected up to the Charter of Rights as sort of that's what our spine is. George Grant did not like the Charter. He did not like the liberalism and the individualism associated with that. He would not have liked gay marriage. He would not have liked abortion laws. There is virtually nothing. He probably would not have liked the bread and circuses of the Olympics. There's very little about Canadian nationalism, that sort of postmodern, internationalist nationalism celebrated by Michael Adams in Fire and Ice, George Grant would have detested all of it. So the nation we become is not one he would have liked.
And I'm also not at all sure how he would have felt about multiculturalism.
No, absolutely.
Well, I'm fairly sure how he. I mean, one of the points.
I might be being a little nice.
No, but Diefenbaker was an ethnic. It's one of the points that Grant is making. Diefenbaker was an ethnic who had bought into that British tradition, not because it was British and he wanted to be a little Englishman, but he actually believed in the thing, that it was the chief voice of liberty in the world. In the case, to get back to Michael's point about rah-rah Canadianism, one of the things that comes home to me every July the 1st, which we're no longer supposed to call Dominion Day, and that was certainly the kind of thing that would deeply rankle with Grant, is the kind of hockey crowd or football crowd enthusiasm that we see manifested in Parliament Hill in Ottawa and right across the country, the people with their faces painted in red and white, jumping up and down and looking very happily about the public holiday and so on. And the I am Canadian thing, which is, you know, intellectually almost on a level with a Molson's ad.
It was a Molson's ad.
Yes, but it's declined since then. This was the sort of thing that would excite his rage, his contempt. Sure, you have a Canada today, but is that Canada worth having? And he explicitly asks in the latter parts of Lament for a Nation whether this thing is worth having, whether it isn't for the best that we just roll it off into the trash heap of history.
Mel.
I think George Grant, he was a nationalist, that's clear, Canadian nationalist, English Canadian nationalist. Most nationalists are nationalists about their own country and don't like other people's nationalism. Grant was a genuine nationalist. He admired that kind of assertion of rights and of self-determination. We're apt to forget that at an early point, George Grant supported the rights of Quebec to self-determination and supported the Quebec nationalist movement, which was not something that Pierre Trudeau agreed with and not something that your average conservative agreed with.
His Lament for a Nation is really a lament for English Canada in many respects,
yes,
isn't
but
it?
I mean, George was very clear. He was very clear in this. I mean, we weren't all involved in these debates at the time. George was remarkable for his ability as an old-timer, as it were, his willingness to support Quebec nationalism. The other thing we should note is that nationalism never goes away. In the 60s, nobody talked about Aboriginal people and Aboriginal rights. Now we have something called the First Nations. That's the brand that the name they choose. Yeah. Would George have liked them? He would absolutely have liked them. George was always on the side of powerless people. I don't know about multiculturalism. That's a hard one. George did not like Pierre Trudeau at all. He probably didn't like the Charter. I think he missed a huge point. I taught Canadian studies for years, and Pierre Trudeau, the irony of Pierre Trudeau is that he preached against nationalism and brought in a charter that caused young people to say, that's what I believe in as a Canadian. That's the deep irony.
Let me pick up on the Quebec angle there. John, I'll go with you to that. Lament for a Nation doesn't spend a lot of time worrying about Quebec's place in Canada. It's
Pas du tout.
Pas du tout, I guess is a good way to put it. Yeah, and follow me on this argument here. We live in a Canada today where Quebec doesn't care a whole heck of a lot about the rest of Canada, and the rest of Canada doesn't seem to care a whole heck of a lot about Quebec. Someone put it this way: they pretend to be a nation, we pretend they're part of Canada. How much of an obstacle to his vision was Quebec?
Well, I don't think it was an obstacle, because I think he sort of saw the two societies as civilizations. French civilization and English civilization living side by side, and from time to time, for him, the idea, I'd never read him as believing that the important project was putting the two of them together.
Right.
You know, it's almost like we're reviewing a sort of parade of former contestants in the pageant of national attention. And one contestant that Grant spoke to is a very old one called "How British Are We?" That was the great debate. That's a Michael Bliss line, and it's really true that a lot of what politics was about 100 years ago, when Canada was 50, was how British are we? When Canada was 100, in 1967, around the time when Grant is writing, the question that Trudeau put in the center was how French are we? Are we going to accommodate the French fact in a way that promotes a genuine pact? I lived, and my generation lived, at the sort of ground zeros of that, where constant immersion programs and our, having to speak French in class and trying to reach out to Quebec and right up until the referendum, which is, I think, had quite an impact on a lot of people of my generation, a personal
Which
kind.
one, first or second?
The second, the scary
95.
one, the really scary one in '95. I think another debate happened along the way, which was how American are we? That was really captured in a great political moment in this country's life, an explicit electoral moment, the 1988 free trade election, where I think everybody at this table played some kind of role in it, one way or another. The whole country did. I think now there's another question, though, and it's sort of moved on. I think your depiction of what's happened in Quebec is all too true. I think, my sense is that the debate about how British are we is over, how French are we has moved off. The debate about how American we are, I think the pretty darn side has largely de facto won that debate. I think the next debate is really, and you see it shaping up in policy and in discourse, is how global are we? It seems to me the fault line now is not so much the anti-Americans versus the non-anti-Americans as people who believe that Canada is really a Western country located in the West, and this goes to what Michael Byers is talking about the Harper government's foreign policy, country located in the Western alliance and part of Western civilization in a world where there are real challenges to Western civilization now, coming from other parts of the world. Or are we a global country that's about the things that Mel Watkins was talking about at the beginning of the program, about environmentalism, about trying to manage common global challenges, instability, failing states, those sorts of things. I think that's the next debate.
You're very prescient, because that's our debate on Monday. Ken Dryden's coming in here to talk about his new book, Becoming Canada.
Canada's a wise man.
One of the most extraordinary things I found in rereading Lament for a Nation, exhilarating to me, and it would be shocking, I think, to many other people, is his quotation from Henri Bourassa and the French national statement from 1918, in which Bourassa is celebrating Quebec's role to bring an unambiguously Catholic French civilization to America. He doesn't consider it in an ethnic French way at all, and all of the bicultural business that we went through in 60s and 70s was merely a linguistic biculturalism. To a Bourassa and to a Grant understanding Bourassa as speaking from another nationalism, one which is compatible with his own, that Catholic vision of America is the thing itself. Free trade agreements and things like that, they can make it, they cannot make it. One of the things he said to me again and again when I would bring up the issues of the day from the early 80s came down to, I don't care. If he actually said to me several times, if I had wanted to concern myself with issues like this, I wouldn't have studied philosophy. I would have studied accountancy.
Andrew, follow up, please.
Yeah, just to amplify David's point about Grant's relationship to Quebec. There's actually this great passage in Lament that I sort of came across last night. I think we were all reading it last night or this morning, where he says, surely it is not simply to preserve the French language that René Lévesque is trying to do. His argument being the French project in Quebec has to be something more. It has to be a civilizational project, conservative Catholic one. And he says, after he says, surely it is more than just preserving French that Lévesque is after, and then he ends by saying, New Orleans is great for tourists. Mm-hmm. It's really dismissive thing, though. You just want to speak French, well, fine. If you just become globalized, a part of the technocracy while speaking French, well, you've failed as well. So, and I think he thinks that unless English and French Canada were both allied, not combined, but allied in this project, building separate conservative societies, there was no point to either of them.
Allied. Yeah. And French language, French only video shops were not his idea of a triumph of nationalism.
No.
Let me put a few more adjectives on the table for Mel Watkins. Socialist, Christian, anti-capitalist. That's how he saw himself, yes? Was this the Canada that he wanted?
Well, what is true is that, to go back to a point that others have alluded to, where was George Grant politically? I can remember a discussion with him and some other New Democrats in the late 1960s in which we were trying to persuade George to endorse something that the NDP was doing or not doing. And George said, in effect, I'm completely on your side, but I can't support you because of your stand on abortion. Mm-hmm. And I think that David is really referring to that. George was a deeply religious man, a deeply Christian man in a world which was becoming increasingly secular, and which most of the New Left had no interest in these religious questions. And that, at the end, you see on the great free trade debate, George voted for Mulroney in the '88 election. Why? because he said they are the last best hope for dealing with abortion. I've given up on the Liberals and I've given up on the NDP. So this is a very principled position that George took, and I find it hard to sort them out. Was George a socialist? No, but those of us who were socialists, George loved us. He never attacked us, he never criticized us.
But you didn't see him as one of you.
Well, he would never have joined the Waffle because he couldn't even join the NDP, given his position on abortion.
Okay, do you know what?
But he wasn't a proselytizer, that's what I'm saying about George too. On other issues, he was very supportive.
Let me go back into the archives here, because here's George Grant with Mike McManus. We did a program here many years ago called The Education of Mike McManus, and we have a clip on this issue. Go ahead, Michael, roll it, please.
I agree with much what democratic socialism says at the level of economics, of decent welfare programs and things like that. But then what always drives me away from them, on what now seems to me the big issues, and I'm sorry to come back to this again and again, but an issue like abortion, I find the socialists are always on the side of great violence. Do you see what I mean? Great, always advocating freedom of a kind where, to me, the essential questions are now. The questions of how we're going to come to terms with technology, and are we going to have it in a human way. I distrust them. I find that most of them are really hidden liberals when you come down to it. And this is always makes me suspicious of them. And I always find that so many of them are anti-religious, do you know what I mean? And that makes me suspicious of them. But I like them economically, if you know what I mean. I'd like to see the corporations controlled. They're a bunch of greedy fellows any day.
Michael Byers, a lot to unpack there. You want to follow up on some of that?
Yes, there's that wonderful saying that New Democrats are liberals in a hurry. I think George Grant would have agreed with that. But on the issues here, I think one needs to always remember that George Grant was rooted in his particular generation, his particular time. And had he been born 40 years later, he might have had a different view on some of these issues. But I suspect that his concern for community, his concern for a country that is a community, that looks after its citizens, where there's a sense of cohesion and above all responsibility to each other, that would have prevailed. I think as well that one has to understand that if George Grant were alive today, he'd be absolutely fascinated by some of the developments we see in the world, by the relative decline of the United States. It's almost a loss of superpower status as a result of the recent global recession, the rise of China, which is now the major creditor to the United States, the importance of technology, this creation of a global village through the internet. I mean, he would have been really excited by all of this. I think he would have been intrigued by the fact that it was Quebec, above all, that kept Canada out of the Iraq War and out of missile defense, thus proving his own thesis about the loss of Canadian foreign policy independence, proving that thesis wrong. I mean, I love the historical talk. I unfortunately didn't know Grant myself. I was born the year after he wrote Lament for a Nation. But what really excites me is thinking about how worry of a later generation, how this profoundly thoughtful man might have engaged with the changes, the developments, the challenges of today.
David Warren, you wanted to follow up on that clip.
There's one particular point I think has to be made here, quite unambiguously. Grant makes it himself in Lament for a Nation, but he also makes it throughout his works, which is he is against progress. This notion that had things turned out differently, he would have a different view, is one that he rejects. At the end of Lament for a Nation, he invokes the names of Plato and Aristotle and says they cannot be understood if we are going to try to understand them as stepping stones to some later philosophers who have a more complete view. If something is true, it is always true. If something is false, it is always false. He would completely reject the notion that the value system that we represent, or our whole view of the world, is something that evolves in one way. We either get towards the truth or we get away from it.
John.
And I think what David's saying, which is really right, and what Mike Byers is saying, which I also really agree with, come together, is that Grant was a fellow who was applying some truths that he believed to be timeless to a very rapidly moving thing called technology. Technology was at the heart of what George Grant talked about, and he did something that was really unusual for a North American thinker. He tried to talk about technology as a political issue. We don't do that here in North America. We treat technology as a given. That's not politics. Politics is what they do in Congress or Parliament Hill or down at the City Hall. But technology, well, that's just what we do. It's kind of normal. Well, as Marshall McLuhan said, we don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish. Over in Europe, where Grant got his training, they think about and thought about a lot, and still do, about what technology does to politics. I think Grant was of the view that technology homogenizes, makes everybody the same. I don't know what he would have made with the phenomenon of countries like China and India adopting technology which he would have seen as fundamentally westernizing and homogenizing, and yet still retaining their own characteristics, their own ambitions, and not exactly dissolving into some universal westernized soup. Anyone who has watched the Chinese behavior everywhere from Copenhagen through to the Western Pacific, through to their buying spree in Europe that was in the Globe and Mail today would say that's a country that is not turning Western. It is adapting technology, which Grant thought would turn them into Westerners, and making it Chinese explicitly. It is an interesting world in which it would have been interesting to see him apply his timeless truths.
One of the points he made to me, and it was one of the sort of the points you make towards the end, is he looked back at the John Locke tradition, which he had resisted all of his life. And he was beginning to look at the world that you're describing, because it was becoming visible in those days, and saying, after all, there are worse views of the world than John Locke held.
Andrew.
Yeah, just to follow up on John's point, Ramsey Cook actually wrote a review of Lament when it came out and made more or less the point John made about China and India, about Sweden. He said, you know, Sweden's got all the technology we have, they're doing the same things, and there's no evidence that Sweden is indistinguishable from the United States of America. And he made a point where he said the mistake that Grant makes is to see technology as operating on nations in the absence of any sort of understanding of the intermediary institutions. He doesn't think in terms of institutions. And I think you actually wrote a piece in the 90s saying that Grant neglected the value of just simply being socialized under parliamentary democracy versus a congressional system actually creates a more robust political culture than we give
How do you
credit
remember
for.
that he wrote that piece in the 90s?
Dangerous man, he does his research.
No kidding. No kidding.
There was a set of essays on Grant, I think, that you wrote that on.
Mel Watkins.
Well, there were two great Canadian icons and prophets of the 1960s, George Grant and Marshall McLuhan. I agree with Ramsey Cook, actually, that both of them got things, they got them right, but they got them wrong, too, because they didn't allow for the institutional world that actually existed. So they saw it as much more easily made homogenous than we now understand to be so. But I think it's, everybody respects Marshall McLuhan for seeing the global village. I think we ought to respect George Grant for seeing this kind of homogenization and globalization that in fact is there. And the thing about both of them is that they are talking about technology. That has been one of the great strengths, I think, of Canadian writing, is that interest in technology, in technique.
In fact, the high Anglicanism of Grant and the Catholicism of McLuhan are things which are very close together.
John.
I'm going to finally get to sass George Grant in a way I didn't when he was at my family dinner table that one magical moment. And I'm going to say I'd like to see some more homogenization, and I'd like to see some more of that kind of conformity happening, because I agree with Mel that the principal challenge going forward of human society is about planetary degradation, climate change in particular, but also what we're doing to our food supply and biodiversity. These shouldn't be values issues. These shouldn't be questions that are divided by politics or by ethnicity or by what civilization you come from, and yet they are. And I think there's a huge fault line. I mean, Grant imagined a politics wrapped around technology and how you feel about it. Sometimes I wonder if the Republican Party in America and the Conservative Party in Canada doesn't harbor the anti-scientific viewpoint in politics, and whether that isn't one of the distinguishing characteristics. In that sense, maybe there is an intellectual successorship to those parties, even though they're globalizers, even though they like America, things that Grant didn't like. At least those parties are with him on technology. That might be some of why people who are pro-life tend to gravitate towards them. So I think some of that deep blue tradition is still alive and well in the approach to a hostility and a reluctance to be about science in a world where I think I'm proud to be part of the other movement, which says universalization, science, and addressing our scientific and technical challenges as a human society, which are threatening to overwhelm us.
Michael Byers, I'm told we're going to lose our satellite to you in about 5 minutes, so let me put you to work one last time here while we still have you. Let me pick up on the sovereignty angle, because Harold Innis, apparently in 1949, said that Canada enjoyed being a nation for a brief spell between being a British colony and then pulled into the American orbit after World War II. Can there be sovereignty in an increasingly interdependent world?
Well, I think that there can, and I think we're going to have a very 1963 type federal election before long if the Liberals continue to raise questions about the purchase of F-35 stealth fighters, greater military interoperability with the United States.
Just explain the reference there, what you mean by a 63-style election.
Well, the 63 election, the one that Grant was angry about, the loss by John Diefenbaker, was about whether or not Canada should accept Beaumark nuclear-armed warheads and missiles on Canadian soil. It was about buying into the American military and economic project. And we have a situation now in Canada where Stephen Harper is pressing forward to spend $16 billion on Lockheed Martin stealth fighters to have greater interoperability with the United States. We have the negotiation of a North American security perimeter, essentially an expansion and deepening of NAFTA that's currently being worked on behind closed doors and may well be produced in the next couple of months, and perhaps that will be the subject of an election. I mean, one of the great things about Grant is that some of the big questions are still alive and well today, and they're worthy of debate, and they're happening even though some people don't refer to George Grant. So Francis Fukuyama wrote an incredibly influential book called The End of History, which was essentially a recapping of Lament for a Nation, but expressed from an American standpoint. And we had Samuel Huntington, A Clash of Civilizations. We had 9/11 and the seeming divide between the United States and the Muslim world. These are big issues, and we need to read Lament for a Nation. We need to read it in its historical and cultural context. But Grant was a very powerful thinker, and I'm glad we're talking about him today, because we're going to need to be provoked by his thoughts in the months and years ahead.
And I presume you not only want us to read Lament for a Nation, but also Intent for a Nation, which is your contribution to subjects that we're talking about today, your relentlessly optimistic manifesto for Canada's role in the world. Michael Byers, it's awfully good of you to join us on the line from Vancouver, BC tonight. Thanks so much for being there.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks to Michael Byers, and we've lost our satellite to Vancouver now, but fortunately we still have you folks here who we're going to put to work for the rest of our time here. Let's pick up on this here. On Monday, I mentioned we're going to be interviewing Ken Dryden, who's got a new book out called Becoming Canada. And in that book, he says, we have paid a huge price for having the wrong sense of ourselves as a country. We do keep redefining ourselves in this country. Is that, David, a kind of a uniquely Canadian thing to do, this constant redefining of who we are?
I think quite the opposite. I think it's the question of the fish who never discovered the water. If you have an identity, it's not a problem for you. When you don't, it becomes a problem. And what I've been listening all the time I've been growing up, which is now unfortunately a long time, has been to Canadians moaning aloud about their identities or whatever. It's not an edifying thing to be doing.
Well, except Ken says that...
Because it's something that you embody. It's not something that you argue. It's not, in fact, as I think perhaps Grant would say as well, it's not something you can put in a manifesto. It's something that you are.
But Dryden says that if we don't get the story of who we are right, it will adversely affect us going forward.
Yeah,
if we don't have a mission statement.
I think, well, I don't want to trivialize that. Obviously, search for Canadian identity, boy, there's a fun topic. I mean, David's right to say that there is something tiresome and whiny about some aspects of that, and constantly researching who you are and pulling yourself up by the roots to see how you're doing. And something self-defeating about that, I suppose. But at the same time, I'm reminded of Keynes's line, well, when, events change, my opinion changes. What do you do, sir? Yeah. Canada is a country that is young, lives in a very rapidly evolving world without a great root structure of tradition. This is a very new country. It's European descended and non-Aboriginal parts anyway. It would make sense that we would be evolving quickly. especially because the world around us is evolving with enormous speed. I have no problem with recalibrating and making mid-course corrections in the sense of, about our sense of who we are. I think that's necessary. I think that's one of the best things about Canada. I'm against whininess, who isn't? But I'm all in favor of thinking carefully about where we're going in our history. That's what Sam Huntington, Francis Fukuyama, and all kinds of good people like George Grant ask themselves. So yes to introspection and thinking clearly about a fastly changing world.
Are you sure as a good liberal you want to be using that word recalibrating? I thought the Conservatives had the trademark on that one.
As long as I don't turn to prorogation and treat the two as interchangeable, I'll feel comfortable with George Grant's nephew, my leader, Michael.
Always looking for new self-definition. Is that us?
Yeah, and it's funny, I was looking for a copy of Lament for a Nation in the bookstore the other day to bone up, and it is depressing because you start to look at the Canadian political science and it's a nation in ruins. Canada, can it survive? Canada, will it survive? You know, it's on and on, right? You start thinking, oh my God.
And yet here we are.
And yet here we are. And I actually, I almost wish John Ralston-Saul were here to sort of spank John down for calling us a young country and saying we have young traditions, because I think Saul's, one of his great contributions to Canada's debate has been to emphasize that Canada has the second longest constitutional tradition in the world, the British parliamentary tradition. That's something he's made a lot of hay out of. And I tend to agree with them. And to that extent, I would come back to David's point that he made 2 decades ago, that we tend to buy into this myth of shared values, the idea that what holds Canada together is that we have common values. And the Liberals under Jean Chrétien hammer that home endlessly. We don't have shared values. That's what it means to live in a pluralistic democracy. So something else is holding us together. And I think a starting point, not the end point, but a starting point is the institutions of the British parliamentary tradition.
You want the last 30 seconds, Mr. Watkins?
Well, I think the issue that exists now, and perhaps it always has, is how do we combine national consciousness with global consciousness, not with imperial consciousness, which is the Canadian experience from France to Britain to America, but now the global issue. And I think the thing to emphasize here is that nation states are not going away. They're still increasing in numbers. If Quebec leaves, it'll become a nation state. The First Nations aren't going to leave, but that's what we're trying to assert. So how do we must understand that George Grant makes us face up to the reality of nationalism. He poses a question, we can all give different answers, but he makes us think about it.
And I'm glad we're doing that 45 years after the publishing of Lament for a Nation. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here on the program tonight. That was great.